All right, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Sharonah Fredrick, who is a clinical assistant professor of Spanish and Portuguese here at UB and Latin American culture. She received a research fellowship in 2018 from the George Smathers Libraries at the University of Florida, where her studies explored the Judeo-Spanish presence in 16th through 18th century Cuban and Peruvian piracy. Sharonah was the director of the Berlitz Global Leadership Training for Latin America and the Middle East from 1999 to 2004, and she was chosen as the 30th anniversary Cardi Memorial Lecturer on 17th century Jesuit crypto-Jewish relations in Brazil at Loyola University in Maryland. She received her doctorate in Hispanic language and literature from SUNY Stony Brook, where she was a Turner Diversity Scholar. Sharonah has been a guest lecturer at Anáhuac University in Mexico and taught at the Ministry of Education in Luanda, Angola. During the past decade, she has published articles and critiques in the Renaissance Quarterly and CONICET in Argentina and in literary journals at the University of Sao Paulo, Brazil, and the University of Monterrey Tech in Mexico. A truly Pan-American and global scholar. And to match that, she also speaks multiple languages: Spanish, Portuguese, Hebrew, English, and with a good reading knowledge of Irish Gaelic, which is amazing in and of itself. So welcome to the Gender Institute, Sharonah, and thank you for bringing a wonderful audience to our final event this semester.
Thank you very much. Thank you to everybody for coming. Thank you very much to my chair for being here, to Amy, who was a magnificent early modernist, to Maggie, who was also a magnificent scholar in Latin American studies, to Laura, who was a wonderful, I love her even though she's a modernist, and to my students who are here, to some of my students who are here, and also to some of our wonderful graduate students, Lauren, and Diana, and you, and everybody else. So thank you, and to everybody I didn't name, thank you all very much. Okay, so we're talking about Lilith. And I don't know what you know about Lilith, but I'm going to begin and talk to you about her. Lilith, the vampire-like siren of Sephardic Jewish folklore, was not a proto-feminist archetype. All of the texts that spoke of her were strictly forbidden to women, and also concealed from most men, except those belonging to fellowships of the Kabbalah. And for those of you who don't know exactly what the Kabbalah was, the Kabbalah is a form of Jewish mysticism which began in 13th century Spain. There was a very large and important Jewish community. Of course, since I am a Sephardic Jew, I have a Jewish-Spanish background, I will tell you the most important Jewish community, but it was extremely important. I'm not being at all subjective. And the major book of the Kabbalah is called the Zohar. Welcome, Maureen. And that is the first time Lilith is mentioned. It is true that in the 20th century, Lilith was often viewed as a symbol of female emancipation, even if, as the scholar Ellen Frankel has correctly noted, she is somebody, if anybody's interested in learning more about Lilith, I do recommend that you look at this scholar, Ellen Frankel, who is the first Jewish woman to analyze Lilith from a historical and academic point of view. I say that because all the previous studies on Lilith done in modern-day Jewish academia were done by men. And I love you men, but sometimes you muck it up. Okay, so Ellen Frankel. As Ellen Frankel has correctly noted, the Lilith legend had its origins as a misogynist rationale for male supremacy. And that's true. It is often cited in the 20th century as a symbol of female emancipation. That is not what it was. Lilith was, in essence, I know I'm being filmed, but I'm going to dare to say this, the wet dream of 13th and 14th century Sephardic Jewish rabbis, and then later some of their Christian friends in the early 16th century, men who were imagining an image of a female vampire, Adam's supposed first wife, and this was not a model for women. This was what women were not supposed to do. I say that because in the 20th century, some of you may be familiar with a magazine called Lilith, which has become kind of became appropriated by late 20th century feminist thought. Lilith is not feminist. Ellen Frankel is right. Okay, so I'm beginning with that disclaimer. So for those of you who didn't know what I meant when I said Lilith was Adam's first wife, let me explain that in the book of Genesis, we have what we call in Spanish, and I've never found a word in English that's better than this one, desfasaje. It's something that doesn't fit, okay? No se encaja, it just doesn't fit. Because at the end of the first chapter of Genesis, God creates man and woman together on the sixth day. You would think that's Eve, right? Adam and Eve. But in chapter 2 of Genesis, Adam is alone. Remember? And he calls out to God and, he's kind of miserable. And God, I'm alone. And then God makes him fall asleep and takes out his rib, and Adam's rib becomes Eve. Okay, so who was that woman created on the sixth day? And in Sephardic Jewish folklore, which once again, folks, every time I say the word Sephardic, get used to that word. It means Jews of Spanish background, or those descended from the Jews who were, of course, expelled from Spain, together with many Muslims, in 1492, and then expelled from Portugal again in 1497. I say that because the majority of the Jews expelled from Spain first went to Portugal, and then Portugal kicked them out too. Okay, so who was that woman created on the sixth day? In Sephardic Jewish folklore, that woman is Lilith. Okay, so first know where the inconsistency comes from, because it's a certain inconsistency in the Bible. We have here Rabbi Sarah from Buffalo's Hillel, and she can tell you more about the book of Genesis than I can, but it is an inconsistency, and it usually was explained away by the rabbis of the late 15th century, right before the expulsion from Spain, by saying, don't ask about it. And I say that because there is a quote from a very famous rabbi from that time, Rabbi Baruch Shem Tov, who said specifically, just don't ask about it. And the reason he was saying that is because the Lilith legends were already kind of legion. Okay, but why does she become so popular? This is why. The increased persecution of Sephardic crypto-Jews, now crypto-Jews, some of you know the word marrano. Please don't say that, because in Spanish, as some of you will know, marrano means pig. And that is the term that was used by the Inquisition to apply to those Jews who hid their Judaism and were living secretly in Spain and in what becomes Latin America, which is conquered by Spain. So we use the term crypto-Judeo, okay, crypto-Jew. The increased persecution of crypto-Jews, secret Jews, in the Spain of Philip II, so just so you know, please let's situate ourselves in the time, 1553 to 1598. The day that he's crowned to the day that he dies. The increased persecution of crypto-Jews in the Spain of Philip II, and now this is even more, the public burnings of so-called relapsed Judíos lapsados is what they're called by the Inquisition, relapsed Jews in Mexico City in 1596, and in Lima, Peru, in 1639. These were public burnings. They were ghastly public burnings at which anybody who was accused of practicing Judaism, Islam as well, secretly, Protestantism, but wait a minute, or being a follower of the Jesuits, because the Jesuits, of course, will be that kick-ass, that kick-ass rebel order within the Catholic Church that will frequently go against Spanish state policy. And both of those autos da fe, acts of faith, which of course refer to the public burnings, supposed secret Jews, secret Muslims, and according to what we know, secret Lutheran Protestants, or simply people accused of that, as well as people accused of being too sympathetic to the Jesuits, were burned. Okay, so we have 1596 Mexico City, 1639 Lima, Peru, and these public burnings make an impact. They created panic in the Sephardic world, obviously not only the world of Sephardic Jews, and they demanded an explanation of God's plan. Although marginal, the Lilith stories offered a teleology. To those, maybe some of my students who don't know yet what a teleology is, this is what a teleology means. A teleology is trying to explain history as though God has a plan for it. Okay? And so that's something we do when we don't know why the nasty things that happen to us. Okay? So the Lilith stories offered a teleology that could include even the Inquisition, because of course it's the Inquisition creating the public burnings, within God's plan. Okay, so now what does all that mean? Imagine the most important community that we, the Sephardic Jews, had destroyed, expelled, those of us who stay in Spain, those of us who immigrate illegally to the New World. Notice the way I'm using the term illegal, because some people like to use that term a lot these days. Okay, anybody who gets out of a country without papers, which is the way refugees always come. We came that way too. And any member of the Sephardic Jewish community, Sepharad, by the way, of course, is the Hebrew word for Spain. Okay, so any member of the Sephardic Jewish community who was in Mexico City secretly, quote unquote illegally, or in Lima, Peru, secretly, or quote unquote illegally, would have seen or known of that auto da fe, the public burning. It was ghastly. It was designed to be ghastly. You know, the Inquisition was public theater on a very murderous level. So you needed some explanation from God. You need your teleology. And the way Lilith fits into this teleology is the following. Lilith, this so-called mythical first wife of Adam, who then disappears. Okay, she's never mentioned in the book of Genesis. She's mentioned once in the Old Testament, and it's not in Genesis. She's mentioned once in the book of Isaiah. That's the only time her name is mentioned. In the book of Isaiah, chapter 34, verse 14. And the only mention of Lilith is that Lilith is weeping in the ruins of Jerusalem. Jerusalem, which at that point had been destroyed by the armies from Assyria. That's the only mention of her. Weirdly enough, when that is translated into English, the King James Bible, okay, early 17th century, the term Lilith is translated as screech owl. Okay, now let me tell you, in Hebrew, that is not the way you say owl. The way you say owl in Hebrew is Yanshuf. Doesn't that sound like Lilith? Lilith and Yanshuf have nothing to do with each other. So why is it translated that way? I don't know. But I will tell you that that may go back to an earlier Sephardic Jewish bit of folklore, which is based on something which existed long before the Jewish religion came into being, roughly 4,000 years ago, roughly. There, in ancient Babylon, going back from what we know archaeologically, and folks, I worked in archaeology in Latin America for a long time, so archaeology and the dates are important to me. In Babylonian archaeology, there are images of a woman and a man together as one being, almost as an androgynous being, called Lilith Lilitu. Okay? And that being is shown as a tall woman with wings, and there are owls at the bottom of the frieze. So somehow she is associated with owls. That's the only mention of Lilith in the Bible, okay, by name. So how do we need her in the teleology? According to Sephardic Jewish folklore, after the expulsion from Spain, after 1492, a popular myth starts to get going. And the myth that starts to get going is, we've been expelled from Spain for a reason. What is the reason? Obviously, God wants us to go back to Jerusalem. I think we were expelled from Spain because the Queen of Spain was a fairly imperialist and racist, nasty person. But if you are, that's Isabel la Católica. But if you are looking for a reason, you will find it. Okay, so how does Lilith come into that? If the Jews go back to Jerusalem by traditional Jewish thought, that is one of the prerequisites for the coming of the Messiah. For my Christian friends here, you're on your second coming, we're on our first. Okay? So, for my Muslim friends here, you're with us. You're also waiting for the first. Okay, so Jews and Muslims have not yet had a Messiah. In Christian thought, of course, you've had Jesus Christ, and you're waiting for the second coming. In Jewish tradition, first Jews have to return to Jerusalem, and then God has to decide that the Messiah is ready to come. So where is Lilith? Lilith is given the unenviable job of testing the virtue of any rabbi who thinks he's virtuous enough to bring the Messiah. I repeat, this is where it gets sexual, and this is where Lilith becomes the kind of violet-eyed female vampire of many 16th and 17th century Sephardic men's fantasies. She has to test them sexually. Okay? Lilith has to seduce any rabbi who says, I am virtuous enough to bring the Messiah. And this is also where the descriptions of Lilith become quite lurid. And I don't want to say, well, maybe even slightly, I'll say pornographic for one reason. Women had nothing to do with these descriptions. So it's very much men just imagining a kind of forbidden woman. Now, Lilith is described for the first time in kind of Olalea, kind of hola everybody. Okay, come in. Loving and, okay, these are my wonderful students. We're not going to be all sitting on the floor. Please film all my wonderful students on the floor. Wonderful students, you may eat as well. Okay, so the mythological character of Lilith is described first in the book called the Zohar, written in 13th century Spain, by a specific rabbi whose name we know. Okay, his name was Moises de Leon, because it was written in the city of Leon. It is not a mystery where the book comes from. Now, of course, within Jewish tradition, we know there's another story that the book was originally written 1,000 years earlier by somebody in a cave outside of Jerusalem called Shimon Bar Yochai, and that he transmitted it to Rabbi Moises de Leon. But if you've ever actually read the Zohar in Aramaic, you know that's impossible because the grammar of the Zohar is 13th century Spanish. So in other words, in Aramaic, it's a bit of a mess. It is translated from Aramaic into the Spanish of the time, and you will permit me to give you a description of Lilith from the Zohar. Adam's mythical first wife. She stands at the entrance to roads and paths in order to seduce men. She stands there at midnight. Guys, anybody listening? This is when you can... She seizes the man who approaches her, kisses him and embraces him, and fills him with a wine, this is where it gets nasty, whose dregs contain the venom of snakes. Those foolish men who come to Lilith and drink this wine commit fornication with her. And what does she do then? She leaves the fool alone, sleeping in his bed, and ascends to heaven. There she gives a bad report of him to the Holy One, blessed be he. That's... Then Lilith obtains permission to descend again. Okay, I want you to understand something about this story. Lilith's boss is God. So Lilith cannot rebel against anything God tells her because she's being ordered to do what she does by God. I say this because when Lilith comes into contact with Christian theology, there's a tendency to portray her as a devil and a vampire. So folks, you have got to understand something about... Welcome, Caitlin. Welcome, Emma. Okay, welcome everyone. Oh, you've got to understand something about Jewish theology. We do not have a hell. Okay, so in Jewish theology, there is no heaven and hell. We have a heaven, and we have a next world, which we call the Olam Haba, and what does God do to the nasty people? We leave that to God. Okay, but we do not have a physical hell in Jewish theology. We do not have a devil in Jewish theology. We have an angel of death, who is kind of similar to those of us who know and love Mexican culture, to the character called La Parca. You know, La Catrina, right? Death in Mexican culture. Death comes. But it's not evil. It's part of God's plan. And I think the best parallel to the idea of death in Jewish tradition is this parallel with Mexican culture. It's just part of life. It's there. It's not evil. It comes. Lilith sometimes brings it. But that's on an order from, upstairs. So Lilith is not a force that goes against God. Okay? So that has to be very, very clear here. So what does she do? Okay, concretely, we are in the year 1499. The Jews have been expelled from Spain in 1492. They were expelled from Portugal in 1497. Muslims were officially permitted to live in the south of Spain, but they were never actually allowed to practice their religion, as they were told they could after the defeat of Granada in 1492. Now, why am I mentioning that? Because the closest connection with Jewish tradition is Muslim tradition, and the closest connection with Muslim tradition is Jewish tradition. And so the Jews and the Muslims of Spain have shared a great deal, and one of the things they've shared is the Lilith legend. Now guys, you see what I'm wearing on my neck? Does everybody see it? Okay. This amulet, like a 5-fingered hand, okay? A blue color, that is called in Arabic, Hamsa, okay? And we use that in Sephardic Jewish tradition. Hamsa literally means the number 5. In Arabic, Hamesh in Hebrew, Hamsa in Arabic. And this is an amulet to guard you from Lilith when she's angry. And if you know anything about Muslim art, you will also see it all over the place. So Sephardic Jews and the Muslims of North Africa share this tradition. And this is how it's going to come to the New World when crypto-Jews and crypto-Muslims, Jews and Muslims who are of Spanish background, who are hiding their religions, because of course the Inquisition doesn't like them, but they bring their religions secretly and they will bring these symbols, okay? So what Lilith is doing, now that everybody is looking for the Messiah, because that is the only explanation people have for the terrible things that are happening. So let's say my friend here thinks he's virtuous enough to bring the Messiah. This is why he's sitting at the head of the table. He's a PhD student and he speaks French. So I think it's suitable, Amy, no?
Obviously demonic.
Right. I think if you speak French, you can bring the Messiah.
I'm also Protestant.
So, wow, there you go. So it gets even crazier. So, he claims he can bring the Messiah. Okay, nice boy. Let's say he does everything right. He fasts, he prays, he is a good man, he does acts of charity. But then he has one more final test, and the final test is Lilith. And now we have to get into the physical descriptions of her. So let's talk about the physical descriptions of her. In the Zohar, that most important book of the Spanish Jewish Kabbalah, she is described as being very tall with violet eyes. Now, tall with violet eyes, the only person I can think of who fits that description is an old-time movie actress by the name of Elizabeth Taylor, who I think had purple eyes. So, tall with violet eyes, black hair, and very beautiful. She's also described as having long nails, so this is obviously a kind of vampirical image. So you think you can bring the Messiah? God sends Lilith and she seduces you. Goodbye, Messiah. In this mythological tradition, which starts to grow up in Sephardic Jewish and Hispano-Muslim folklore, particularly in the second part of the 16th century, Lilith is the litmus test. You think you can bring the Messiah? No. To bring the Messiah, you have to withstand Lilith. You couldn't do it, Cookie, so goodbye. The Messiah doesn't come. And so, in a way, Lilith functions a little bit the way Satan, who again, in Jewish tradition, Satan is not the devil. Satan is the angel of death, and the angel of death follows God's orders. She functions a little bit the way Satan does in the biblical book of Job. okay, where Satan says to God, you think Job is a righteous man? Job has it easy. He's rich. He has work. He has a family. Make him lose his job. Kill his family. See how nice he is. Okay, so it's this litmus test of virtue. Now, what I want you to think of is we are now in the second half of the 16th century. Mentally, I am always in the second half of the 16th century. So are you. We're fine. Okay, so those of us who are early modernists are always kind of stuck there. The second half of the 16th century is an incredibly important time in terms also of the coming together of worlds. And so we have a lot of people going back and forth across the ocean. And by the end of the 16th century, there is a small illegal, that word again, it's a terrible word to use with human beings, but we were illegal, supposedly. No human being is illegal. Film that. No human being is illegal. But we were considered illegal by the Inquisition. And so there was a small illegal, come in, welcome, come in, Hannah. There is a small illegal Jewish community in Mexico City. We're in the year 1596, okay? There's a reason I'm picking that year, in the year 1596. And there is a small illegal Jewish community in Lima, Peru. And there is a small illegal Jewish community in Cartagena, Colombia, okay? 3 centers of illegal Jewish tradition. There is an illegal, supposedly Moorish, no, as it's called in Spanish, los moros, let's use the correct word, musulman. There is also an illegal Muslim community in all of those cities. Of course, you understand that from the point of view of the Inquisition, a Jew and a Muslim are equally detestable, and so, so that meant the same thing to the Inquisition. We don't want, from the Inquisition's point of view, their presence was equally unappetizing. The Lilith stories at the end of the 16th century become the property of women. Listen close to what I'm saying. This is where things start changing. The early Lilith stories, as we saw in the first part of the talk, are written down in Spain by men in the Sephardic Jewish community, and later in the Muslim community in Andalusia, in the south of Spain. But with the expulsion of the Jews from Spain, and then by the time you get to the second half of the 16th century, you get the formal beginnings of the expulsion of what's left of the Muslim community in Spain. Remember, those are the wars that Philip II wages against the Moriscos, right? The remnants of the Muslim community in Spain that are still hanging out in the mountains. By that point, neither the Jews of Spanish background nor the Muslims of Spanish background have a world they can hold on to. Everything is chaotic. They are refugees. Okay, and I'm just thinking of this because I'm thinking of the caravan in the news. Okay, it's a similar situation, and we were caravans too. And there's no more institution. So who is preserving these stories? Women. Women. And the folklore, by the end of the 16th century, moves from male-authored texts to female, orally transmitted stories. And in these stories, the character of Lilith will go from being this kind of frightening female vampire that she's imagined to be originally in the Zohar in the 13th century, to being a sympathetic character, to being, in fact, the heroine of the stories. Okay, I find that very interesting from a gender point of view. Because when it's people in the very patriarchal power structure of Jewish Spain, Christian Spain, or Muslim Spain, writing about Lilith, she's evil. Because she's a strong woman, so she has to be evil. When it's women talking about her, she's kind of cool. And she's no longer frightening. Okay, let me give you a concrete example of this. So you see me wearing the Hamsa, and is anybody wearing red? Yes, Tillman has come armed against Lilith. Rabbi Sarah, very good. Armed again, particularly. Deanna, okay, you've got the pants, so we have some protection against. Becky, here at the Gender Institute. Red is a protection against Lilith. Eunice. Also, Connor, your hat, at least. Okay. Red is a protection against Lilith. Traditionally, Sephardic Jewish women tied a red string around their wrist when they were giving birth to avoid Lilith from taking away their child. Because traditionally Lilith was associated in Spanish Jewish tradition with the death of a child. Because deaths in childbirth were extremely common. So if the child was stillborn, born dead, that was attributed to Lilith. But now what happens when the legends in the late 16th century stop being the written legends? Because obviously if you are Jewish or Muslim living in colonial Latin America, you cannot study as a Jew or a Muslim openly. This has got to be under the table, illegally. When they become transmitted orally, suddenly Lilith is not the evil vampiress who steals your children. She comes to you and she protects you, and she says, put on the color red, because red will protect you against evil. Okay, so it's very interesting to see that as the stories become told by women, the idea of Lilith changes from the evil vampire to the protectress of women. And of course the Hamsa, that sign, the five-fingered hand on my amulet, which has to be in the color blue, and that's why I have it blue, also becomes the way Lilith protects women in childbirth. Okay, so this is fascinating to me in terms of a gender change. And I think it also reminds us how important the oral tradition is, because, in many cultures, I'm thinking in particular of the West African griot tradition, there are magnificent things transmitted via oral culture, and we have to see how the changes, the philosophical changes in oral culture are mirrored when the gender switches. Okay, now, in Spanish Jewish tradition, and this goes into general Jewish tradition, so my Ashkenazic, my Eastern European Jewish brothers and sisters have also heard the word. There's something called the Sitra Achara. Sitra Achara is a term in Aramaic. Sitra, you can spell that S-I-T-R-A. And Achara, let's spell that in Spanish, A-J-R-A, because we know in Spanish, J is a Ch. Okay? Sitra Achara literally means the other world. That's a very ancient mystical belief that there's another realm somewhere, usually under the sea. But people in the 16th century, this idea of another realm becomes the New World. It becomes the Americas. So in popular Jewish tradition, the Sitra Achara was no longer under the Red Sea, where it was in classical Spanish Jewish tradition. It becomes the New World. And so Lilith becomes strongly identified with the New World. And Lilith is also a kind of unofficial protectress of those who flee to the New World to try to get away from the Inquisition. Now you could say, wait a minute, Sharonah, you just said the Inquisition publicly burned Jews in Mexico City, in Lima, Peru, and in the early 17th century they're going to start it in Cartagena, in Colombia. So how are they getting away? This is how people, there were horrible public burnings, or again, know the term in Spanish, autos da fe. There were horrible public burnings in the New World, but there were also more places where you could hide in the New World. New World is big. So while the Inquisition could get some people, it couldn't get all people. And so, for example, right outside of Mexico City, folks, there's a lovely little city called Pachuca. And in Pachuca, people will tell you, ay, aquí tenemos judíos aztecas, we have Jewish Aztecs. And I thought, well, that's interesting. So I actually got to know that community personally. They are Chichimec Indians who were secretly converted by some of my forefathers fleeing Sephardic Jews in the late 16th and early 17th century. And then they become persecuted by the Inquisition. And they must have been the Inquisition's nightmare. Indians and Jews. And, all right, so, but they still retain their own synagogue, and they retain their own prayers in Nawa and in Hebrew, which is absolutely fascinating. So Lilith, the Lilith stories now go into a completely different framework. And now please let me mention my friends to the north, because I don't want to forget Canada. And I would like everybody to remember that the term Latin America was invented by a French scholar in late 19th century Mexico. His name was Dominique Michelet, the first person to ever use the term Latin America. So we have to include Quebec in this, because many Sephardic Jews also fled to Quebec. Now there, folks, the Inquisition was not always a tool of Catholic policy. Most Catholic countries did not persecute the Jews, which is precisely why, as my wonderful colleague Laura knows, I am almost as Italian as she is, because all of my family fled from Spain to Livorno and Genova. This is where she is from. And they were there till the late 19th century when they went to Argentina. So Catholic Italy, well, there wasn't any Italy then, but the city-states were fine about accepting Jews. And I have to tell you, so was France. Okay? And so a lot of Jews get to Quebec. Well, a lot. I mean, not that many, but there were some. And there the Lilith stories combine with a classic French story of Melusine, which is a very freaky and interesting story of a woman with a tail. She's a bit of a mermaid serpent, who, like Lilith, she's not a bad person. I mean, the bad people here are the human beings. The demons are fine. And Melusine is traditionally associated with a kind of female siren who appears in the skies late at night and portends the doom of, originally in the story that I read, the ruling family of Luxembourg. Interestingly enough. She's a common figure in French folklore, and she becomes transported to the New World as well. So Lilith starts blending with these characters, and while we're talking a lot about Latin America, folks, Latin America also includes Quebec. Latin America means any part of America where a Latin-based language is spoken. So for my French friends, you're also, we just annexed you. You are now, Amy, you are Latin Americans. Okay, so the Sitra Achara we see is now identified as the New World. And here we start to have an interesting convergence of legends in Mexico and in Peru. Now let's talk about a very famous legend from Mexico, which is called La Mulatta De Cordoba, meaning kind of the light-skinned black woman of Cordoba. Now there's a Cordoba in Mexico, what was a little colonial city in the early 17th, late 16th, early 17th century. It was founded. There's also a Cordoba in Argentina. And of course, there's the original Cordoba in Andalusia in Spain. Here, however, we are referring directly to that city of Cordoba that was in Mexico. And we know that because the story talks about the Inquisition in Mexico. So according to this story, a very beautiful mulatta, okay, and here I'm going to say her status as a black woman, it plays an important part in this story. Because black women were also suspect by the Inquisition. They were always blamed for practicing quote-unquote African witchcraft, which frequently was just herbal medicine. Okay, so La Mulatta de Cordoba is taken by the Inquisition, and she is imprisoned and this is interesting because they mention where it is. She's taken from Cordoba and imprisoned in La Plaza de Santo Domingo in La Ciudad de Mexico. So the Plaza of St. Dominic in Mexico City is the old site of the Inquisition. And when you visit Mexico City today, you can still see the kind of very creepy old palace of the Inquisition, replete with torture instruments, etc., etc. That's where it is. And so La Mulatta de Cordoba is imprisoned there. And one of the guards comes to her one day and says to her, we need, for our records, we need to know if you were married, or are you single, or are you a whore? That's what she's asked. And she says, interestingly enough, I was married to the first man that God created. Oh, okay, whoops. Focus back. Suddenly this connects with the early legends of Lilith. In 13th century Spanish Jewish tradition, that she was that wife that God created for Adam on the 6th day, the unnamed woman of the first chapter of the book of Genesis. So the prison guard apparently was not too well read, And he just said, what? And walked out. And then comes back the next day when Lilith is starting to draw an image of a boat on the wall. Okay, you noticed I just called her Lilith. Whoops. Because in oral tradition on the west coast of Mexico, near the city of Acapulco, there are two black Mexican communities. That's something often that people don't know. Okay, Mexico has an amazing amount of culture. It also has Afro-Latino culture, right? There are two small black communities near the city of Acapulco, and they have these stories. And when I visited there in 2009, and I started doing my research actually for the article that was the basis for the ongoing research I'm doing, they tell the story of La Mulatta De Cordoba, and they just call her Lilith directly. So it's conflated. So Lilith is, let's call her that, drawing an image of a boat on the wall, and the prison guard says to her, you're not allowed to draw, you're not allowed to write. And she just kind of smiles at him and says, yeah, and she keeps on drawing, and he gets angry, and then she turns around and she has fangs. And blood is seeping down, so now this becomes very Twilighty. And he runs out, which is, I guess, what you do when the person you're talking to grows fangs with blood streaming down. And he comes back with the guards from the Inquisition, but she's not there. And all that's left is the image of the boat and a huge hole in the wall where something like a boat has gone through, and she has, what he sees is the boat flying. Okay, now this is important, folks, because in oral Sephardic Jewish tradition, Lilith flies. And Lilith appears, remember her function, she has to tempt the person, usually a rabbi, who at that point was always a man. Okay? In Reform Judaism, and I say that being a member of a Reform Jewish community, we have women rabbis, and our rabbi here is a woman. But that's a very different thing. At that point, only men could be rabbis. So remember, Lilith had to tempt the rabbi who said he was virtuous, and in our folklore, she would always fly into the window at midnight. Why midnight? Midnight in all folklore is like a portal to another world, right? Day and night crossing, and she would appear very beautiful with long fangs. Okay, so there is an image of her as a vampire-ish type. So who is La Mulatta? And they start asking, who is she? Who is she? Nobody knows her name. And then there's this weird cryptic reference where they say, some of the slaves know her name. Okay, so some of the slaves know her name. Now, I'm careful when I say this, but the descendants of those Africans who were brought as slaves to Mexico, who live today on the Pacific coast of Mexico, call her Lilith. Okay, so this is very interesting. Why is this also interesting from a cultural point of view? Because you start to see a type of oral connection between marginalized groups, right? Illegal, quote-unquote, Sephardic Jews in colonial Latin America, black people who will always be blamed, simply for being, and the folklore starts to merge. There was, in Bolivia, in the late 16th century, we're still back in the late 16th century, a Muslim by the name of Amir Sigala. Amir Sigala, who was the kind of Muslim equivalent of the crypto Jews. He came to Bolivia supposedly as a believing, practicing Catholic from Spain, and then he came out of the closet 20 years later and declared that he was a Muslim. And interestingly enough, although he disappears, quote-unquote, quickly later, there's a tremendous amount of folklore connected with him in Bolivia, and that folklore connects him to small Muslim communities, which then move up into the Amazon. Now, why is this interesting? We know already in the late 18th century there were small Muslim communities in the Amazon in Brazil. That was illegal. So were the Jews who were living there. But Brazil also now comes into this story because there are Lilith stories all up and down the Amazon. And apparently they traveled up and down the Amazon before they get to Peru. And it's in Peru for my Spanish speakers, and particularly for my wonderful Spanish 210 class. God bless you all who are here. You guys are going to know who I'm talking about now. Ricardo Palma, that we were about? Yes. They all did wonderfully on their exam. So the author, the Peruvian author Ricardo Palma, wrote a series of folkloric tales called tradiciones, traditions. And in one of the first stories, called Don Dimas, that's D-I-M-A-S for anybody writing it down, Lilith appears. What is she doing? What is Lilith doing? Lilith, in the story of Don Dimas, is sent by the angel of death, sent by Satan, who, remember, in Jewish tradition is not evil, just the angel of death. Lilith is sent by the angel of death to Don Dimas to take him to hell. Okay, now this is interesting because Ricardo Palma, remember, is Catholic. And he was a Catholic who knew very well Spanish Jewish tradition in Peru. And so he is taking something from Jewish literature, which at this point is still completely oral in Latin America, and inserting it into one of his stories. And so every reader of Ricardo Palma in the late 19th century suddenly gets to know Lilith from this story of Don Dimas. Now the fact that a writer as important as Ricardo Palma, and as my Spanish 210 class knows, Ricardo Palma is one of the most important writers of 19th century Latin America, the fact that a writer as important as Palma is sticking Lilith into his stories shows how strong the presence of Lilith was as an element of folklore in Latin America at this point. By the way, for those of you who study English literature, you might be interested to know that the poet Robert Browning has a poem written about Lilith, Adam and Eve together. Okay, and that poem is from the early 1830s. Okay, so we see the Lilith stories get to Peru. Now, one group of Jews who had fled from Spain to Italy and settled specifically in the city of Genova created a whole bunch of folklore about Lilith, which then comes to Brazil. Why Brazil? For those who don't know, Brazil and Argentina both had a very, very important wave of Italian immigration, actually beginning during the early modern period. That means during the 16th and 17th centuries, continuing into the 18th and then particularly the 19th centuries. So now here comes probably one of the most famous stories of Lilith, which originates in Genova, Italy, and then becomes rewritten in Brazil. Lilith in this story is married to Satan, whom we also call, when I say we, I mean in Sephardic Jewish tradition, we call Satan Samael. You spell that S-A-M-A-E-L. Samael, which means of the left hand. Now, in Jewish tradition, we can tell if you are possibly a child of Lilith because Lilith has had children, and some of the children are found among us, and they look just like us, and you might be one of them. In Sephardic Jewish tradition, you are a child of Lilith somehow, you have some connection to her, if you are left-handed. Do I have any left-handed people here? One child of Lilith.
My daughter.
Your daughter. One child of Lilith. Oh, wow. If you have green eyes, we have none of Lilith's kids here. If you have red hair, or if you have freckles. All of these traits were considered evidence that you had been one of the children that Lilith had with Samael. Now here's something interesting in Hebrew. The children of Adam and Eve are called Bnei Adam, literally the sons of Adam. It becomes gender flipped when we talk about Lilith's children because they are called Bnei Lilith, the children of Lilith. In this Italian story which travels to Brazil, Lilith is married to Samael. They have a lot of Bnei Lilith, they have happy children, and they are living in the Sitra Achara, this other realm, which by this point is just identified with the Americas. They're living happily. in the other world. And then Lilith gets a call from her employer. Now please remember, her employer is, so you can't say, I'm out to lunch. And God says to Lilith, Lilith, you have to test an Italian rabbi. No, I don't want to travel. Well, no, you have to test an Italian rabbi. His name is Joseph della Reina. By the way, folks, just so you know, Joseph della Reina was a real historical figure, and Joseph della Reina was possibly the most important rabbi of the late 16th, early 17th century Jewish community in Italy, what we now call Italy, because it wasn't Italy, it was city-states then. So Lilith says, yuck, what do I have to do? And God says, the usual, he thinks he can bring the Messiah. I want you to test his virtue. Now here, what happens is fascinating. Lilith says, and remember folks, this story is written by Italian Jewish women and told by Italian Jewish women. So this is after the expulsion, all the stories of Lilith are told by women. Lilith says, I don't want to test his virtue. I am happily married to the angel of death. God, leave me alone. So we have this idea of Lilith as a virtuous wife. Okay? I do not want this sexual experience. And God says, don't worry, it won't come to that. Lilith then talks to her husband, who, and by the way, Samael is described also as being very tall, with green eyes, and many muscles. So I guess this is where women start getting the fantasy, right? Okay, Samael says to Lilith, don't worry, I won't leave you alone. Okay, so this is fascinating, because they go as a couple to the house of Joseph della Reina. So they fly from the Sitra Achara. Imagine them coming up from the Amazon River, flying across the Atlantic to Italia. They're in Genova. And they knock on the door of Joseph della Reina. But do they knock on the door? No, folks. They paw on the door, because they come in the form of two large black dogs. So, if anybody here has a black lab, I would like to tell you that in Sephardic Jewish tradition, that could be Lilith. So for anybody who has a big black dog. And God bless you. Literally, God bless you. So Joseph della Reina takes pity on the two dogs, who once he gets them in the house, and he's being nice and feeding the poor little doggies, they become two beggars. That's the way Lilith and Samael are disguised. And Joseph della Reina, who's in the middle of trying to bring the Messiah, which in Jewish tradition means he's got to fast. He has to abstain from sexual relations with his wife. Okay, for those who don't know or maybe more familiar with the Catholic tradition, where the priest has to be celibate, in Jewish tradition, I don't want to say the rabbi has to be married, but he almost kind of has to be married. And it's traditional that he, and now she, will have a family. But if the person is trying to bring the Messiah, they have to abstain from sexual relations for that time. So Joseph della Reina is in the middle of this, and when he sees suddenly the two black dogs have become two human beings, he is rather frightened. And he asks them, who are you? Who are you? Because normal dogs don't do this. And they just say, we are two servants of God. Now, folks, this is also important, because Lilith and Samael, Lilith and the angel of death, are servants of God. They are not seen as the devil. They only do what God wants. Sometimes God wants some rather funky things. So they start to cry. And Joseph della Reina says, why are you crying? I just fed you when you were in your appearance as dogs. And Lilith says to him, and this is a direct reference to a Jewish tradition connected with our Sabbath, which, as many of you may know, starts on Friday night and ends on Saturday night. Lilith says to Joseph della Reina, I need to smell some spices. Now, typically at the end of the Jewish Sabbath, we light a big candle called the Havdalah Candle to differentiate the holy day from the rest of the week, which is not holy, and we pass around a box of spices, which smell very sweet, and the idea is that you should have a sweet week. So Lilith says, I need to smell some spices. And then an angel comes in and says to Joseph della Reina, don't listen to a woman's voice. Okay, now this is also important, folks, because in the late 16th century, there is a whole tradition in Christianity, in Judaism, and in Islam that a woman's voice is by and of itself sinful. And there is a very, very important scholar of music in the late 16th century. Her name is Catherine Butler, who has studied this, and she has found that references to Queen Elizabeth I, of course, the very important sovereign in the second part of the 16th century, often refer to Elizabeth Tudor, Queen Elizabeth Tudor of England, as being sinful because she liked to sing. Now, I also have to tell you that in very Orthodox Jewish tradition, the woman's voice is also considered overly seductive. Okay? So, we have this connection of the woman's voice. This is important because in Spanish Jewish tradition, folks, we have a bunch of poetry, which is sung poetry, which is called romancero, the romances. And they are traditionally associated with the music of Lilith. Okay, so again we have this connection with something seductive, not outright sexual. Joseph de la Reina hesitates, but he approaches Lilith and he gives her the spice box. And when he gives her the spice box, then the story becomes kind of traditional Gothic. Fire shoots out of Lilith's eyes, blood starts streaming down her chin, her teeth grow. There is this constant reference, folks, to the teeth growing. So there is this vampirical aspect. And then Lilith says to the rabbi, and I want to quote this, folks, from the original story, which is actually written down in Italian for the first time in the year 1609. Lilith says, "Listen to the voice of the Almighty. Pay heed, Rabbi Joseph de la Reina. No human has the power to end the exile." No human has the power to end the exile. The Sephardic Jews still viewed themselves as being in exile from Spain. Now this is interesting because in other Jewish tradition that would refer to the exile from Jerusalem. But here it refers to the exile from Spain. And so here Lilith is speaking in the name of God, and she says, "Remember, Joseph, God alone will hasten the redemption of the Jewish people and of the world when the right time comes." In other words, don't you try to hurry the coming of the Messiah. So we see that Lilith is not bad in this new oral tradition which develops in the Americas, Italy, and North Africa following the expulsion from Spain and Portugal. Now the last story I want to tell you, and then leave this open for questions, because I dearly hope after all this you have some questions, and if you don't, again, God bless you, because these things are a bit odd. There is a wonderful collection in Spanish and Judeo-Spanish, which for those of you who don't know is actually my native tongue. Judeo-Spanish is a language sometimes called Ladino, which is actually 15th century Spanish. That's the language I was brought up speaking. But most Sephardic Jews now no longer speak that language, and Ladino just kind of crossed into Spanish in Latin America. So this collection is in Judeo-Spanish or Ladino, Arabic, Spanish, and you're kind of screwed if you only read English. However, it's also been translated into German. Tillman, you can do it, but if you just read English, I don't know what to tell you. The collection is called Leyendas, Legends. And the story originates in Peru, but it is found in 3 cities in Italy, where you have Sephardic Jewish communities. It is found in 2 cities in Morocco, one of which does not have a Jewish community, so this means it is common to Muslims and Jews. And it is also found in 2 little pueblos in Mexico. The story is called The Father's Testament. And let me just read to you my version of it so you can kind of understand it, what happens in this story. Lilith in this story merges human and supernatural bloodlines. She falls in love with a mortal man to whom she says, I want you to take my child. Find him someone to marry and give him all good things. Now, how does that mortal man actually meet Lilith? He is described, he's never given a name, Lilith's human husband. He is described as being an adventurer who wants to cross the ocean. Okay, folks, once again, think of the 16th, 17th century. You can't make a go of it in Europe. What do? Go to the New World. Try your luck there. Okay? However, there's a shipwreck. Okay, major theme in 16th century literature, because ships are going back and forth. And he is thrown into the Sitra Achara. Remember, the other world. Folks, this should remind you of one of Shakespeare's plays. Remember The Tempest? Okay, so these things keep on appearing. Where is this place? God knows. Literally, God knows. Somewhere in the New World. And so this adventurer meets Lilith. And she falls in love with him and says to him, now you can ask, wait a minute. In the other Italian story, she's married to Samael. Folks, in this story, this Lilith is the daughter of the older Lilith. So there's a bit of a dynasty. There's Lilith 1 and Lilith 2. So Lilith 2 says to this adventurer, look, my love, I am a she-demon, but I know the ways of a woman. I can give birth to a child. I can do anything. Folks, in Jewish tradition, the term demon is not what it is in Christian tradition. We use the word in Hebrew, shedim, which was translated into English in the King James Bible as a shade. Think of it as a goblin and not a devil, okay? Not a devil. So Lilith bears her husband, he is designated as being from the Sephardic Jewish community of Ravenna. Once again, the Italian. Oh, the Italians, you always get into it. Okay, so he's an Italian Sephardic Jew. And she bears him a child, and the child's name is Solomon. Now this is very, very important, because in Spanish Jewish folklore, King Solomon, who of course is the king who builds the temple in Jerusalem, and who in Muslim tradition is also Suleiman, the wisest king, the king of the genies. Supposedly he has a ring. Okay, now you probably can't see this and know this is not the ring, but it's supposed to be a four-cornered ring, so I have a lot of jewelry, and here's a four-cornered ring, which enabled Solomon to harness the power of all the goblins and the sprites, or the shedim, as they're called in Hebrew, to help him build the temple. Okay, now again, in Muslim tradition, Solomon, Suleiman, has power over the genies. So it's a similar idea. Okay, so it's interesting that the child of Lilith, the young Lilith, and this young Italian Jew from Ravenna, now that they're both in the Sitra Achara, the other world, the new world, they have a child named Solomon. Does that refer to King Solomon? God knows, but that name is not accidental in any way. Okay, so everything is fine, and he stays with her in the Sitra Achara, and things are groovy. And then he says to her, you know where this is coming? I have a wife back home. Okay, now, those of us who know New World history, we know the Malinche in Mexico, right? The lover of Hernan Cortez. And then, of course, after Cortez finishes the conquest of Mexico, he says to Malinche, guess what? I have a wife back in Spain. Okay, so this is a very common motif. And Lilith says something unprintable to him, so I will not tell you what she says. But she is really crestfallen, and she says, look, she's very understanding at first. She says, you can go back to her, but please just come back to me after a year to take our child. and to raise them among your people, humans. But he doesn't even do that. I mean, he's really a cad. Okay? He's a real cad. He's what we call in Argentina a guarro. So he just is there. So he goes, and she mourns him for a year, and then she decides to do something unthinkable. She leaves the Sitra Achara, and she goes back to Italy to look for him, because of course he's gone back to Ravenna. Now I want you to think about this in terms of the New World. Imagine like a Native American woman, you know, going to Europe, saying, I'm going to find the conquistador who told me I was his only one and then left me alone. Which again, this is a very common motif in New World literature. So she finds him in the Sephardic Jewish community of Ravenna, and she says, she brings her child, little Solomon is with her. And she says to him, you didn't come back after a year, and you took a vow in the name of God. Now folks, swearing in Jewish tradition is a big no-no. Remember that one of the 10 Commandments is you shall not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. So in Jewish tradition, if you swear and you don't comply, that is very bad news. She says, you took a shvuah. Shvuah in Hebrew is the official oath. God is going to be angry at you. Once again, remember, this is Lilith as an agent of God, not as a rebel. And what does he say to her? He's really a cad. He says, I will hand you back our ketubah. The ketubah is the wedding certificate. You know that I'm rich. My father has left me a fortune amassed during his life. Lilith, I'll give you the money, and you must go. Okay, so he's really talking to her as though she is a whore. Shaken, Lilith realizes that her hope of a human family has been dashed. It seems that despite earlier descriptions of Lilith as a beautiful whore, such as the description we find in the Zohar, and if anybody wants that quote, it's the Zohar 1, chapter 1, verse 14. By the way, for those of you who read Spanish, there is a fantastic translation of the Zohar, which is part of the Jewish Kabbalah, part of Jewish mysticism, and the person who did that translation was one of the greatest writers of contemporary Spain, Miguel de Unamuno. So I don't know if I can recommend anything as good in English. In German, we have Gershom Scholem's translation, so if you can read German and you can read Spanish, you're fine. If not, read ancient Aramaic. Appearing to accept the deal, Lilith asks her husband one boon only, a final farewell kiss. The man yields to Lilith one last time, and then the narrative turns on a fatal mix of sex and death. Lilith suffocates him in the kiss, and he drops down dead. And the story says, and while he was kissing her, she strangled him and left him dead. Her revenge is concluded. Interestingly, Lilith does not extract any collective punishment from her ex-husband's kin. Interestingly enough, she makes a pact with her husband's human wife, who's now her husband's human widow. And that woman will raise the child Solomon within the community. Within the logic of the narrative, Lilith's crime of passion, that last deadly kiss, is entirely understandable, if not indirectly justified. In this story, folks, the most sympathetic characters are the goblins and the demons. The problem are the human beings. And this is, I would say, kind of the final element regarding these Lilith stories. People are the problem. The supernatural creatures are fine. People are the problem. And if you can think of these stories again being told during the 16th, 17th, 18th century, when Jews and Muslims were fleeing as refugees across the sea from the old world to the new world illegally, and living in the new world illegally because the Inquisition was all over the new world, in both Spanish and Portuguese America, people were telling these stories as symbols. And the idea was God has some purpose for us we don't understand. Lilith somehow is communicating this purpose to us. It's people who failed. It's not God. It's not the angels. It's not the demons. It's people who are the problem. Which is why in this new batch of stories, or in the oral stories told by women, told by Jewish and Muslim women in the New World and Italy, this is why those stories present her as being so sympathetic. I just want to say one more thing. Why Italy? Why always Italy? Is it because I have Italian family connections? Could be, but it's another reason as well, folks. The Italians are actually the first Catholic travelers in the New World to denounce the crimes of the Spanish Empire. So this is important because in Spanish propaganda, they will always say, oh, it's the Protestants saying nasty things about us. No, folks, the first book written about the crimes of the Spanish Empire in the New World was written by somebody named Girolamo Benzoni. It's from 1524, and he was an Italian priest. That's not a Protestant. Okay? So then this connection, the Italian connection to the New World, is a very, very important one. And it's why there's going to be such a heavy influence of Italian tradition, both Jewish and Christian, in all of these stories. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic.
It was a pleasure.
Fantastic. Wow. Let's open up the floor to questions.
I certainly hope you have some questions after all this weirdness. Something.
If you need to go, I understand if you have classes. I wanted to ask a question. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, no, I can go next if you want to ask a
I just
question.
wanted to ask a question about women's anger.
Yes, women's anger.
And because that amulet is...
Women are angry.
Right. That amulet is itself a kind of protection against women's rage. There's been a number of books recently published on women's anger. And I was wondering whether or not in these different incarnations of Lilith, if that kind of emotionality changes. When it's the women telling the stories in the New World versus the original version.
Yes, it changes so dramatically, the stories almost become completely different. I mean, all the Lilith stories of the New World are based on that 13th century story from Leon, from Spain, about Lilith being the kind of vampirical creature God creates for Adam on the 6th day and then takes her away. But there's something I forgot to mention. Why does God take her away? And this has to do with women's anger. In the Zohar, it is said that Lilith wanted to have the topmost sexual position with Adam. And Adam did not like that. She's a strong lady. And so she's expelled from the Garden of Eden. Now, we have to be careful with this because it's easy to say, oh, see, that's very feminist. But that was a man, that was Rabbi Moises de Leon, who was in no way a feminist, writing that. So I think that has a little bit more to do with male fantasy than female anger. What I think is that once you leave Spain and Portugal and you get to the New World or Italy, Jewish and Muslim women as well, are going, and North Africa, because many of these stories also come from Morocco, so our Moroccan cousins have a lot to do with this as well. Then women do start to express their anger. And it's basically expressed in a kind of sideways, I think it is in English, sideways style of, hey, come here, woman, I'm Lilith. They've told you I'm evil, but I'm not. I'm cool. I am really cool. So they told you I'll kill your children, but I won't. Here, I'm giving you this amulet. Put the amulet on. That will protect you from everything. So it's kind of a wink, wink, nudge, nudge thing. It's like, ooh, you know, we know this, and you think she's bad, but we know Lilith is cool. And then something really lovely happens with the Lilith legends, because she's also considered to protect people who have disabilities. And that is very close to a story that the Mayan Indians have in Yucatan, of another female kind of supernatural character, the Maya, called the Shtabai, who, like Lilith, waits for men at crossroads, but only nasty men, only men who are unfaithful to their wives. That's the story. And the Shtabai also is supposed to protect children who've been born with something physically not quite right. So you have this idea of Lilith, and the Mayan Indians have it with the Shtabai, as someone who helps the people who are marginalized. And I think that's the way the anger is expressed. In a lot of the Italian Lilith stories, Lilith is a complainer, and she's always telling God, hey, please leave me alone. Really, I don't need this. In the Italian stories, and that's interesting because, look, Italy will be closer to Spain. Half of Italy was under Spanish imperial control, in the late 16th century. So maybe the anger that's expressed there isn't even a Jewish thing. Maybe it's an Italian thing. Because, we forget, but when Spanish armies were in the New World, they were also sacking Rome, folks. So,
They left a very indelible trace.
it was a pretty horrible trace what Spanish armies did in Rome in the 1520s. So, we forget those parts.
Supposed to be colonial rage.
Yeah. So the Italians had their colonial rage as well. Yes.
So, I think that as, we haven't known each other very long, Sharonah, but...
Now you're afraid to ever
know-
get to know me.
Oh, I wouldn't say that horribly. I'm actually really intrigued by one aspect.
Go for
I
it.
want to turn a little bit to the B'nai Lilith. Now,
Okay,
as
Children of Lilith.
Yeah. Now, as you know, my area of expertise is New World Franco-Canadian literature, but I'm also really interested in the jumping-off points from the New World, particularly in Brovrais, which many of you may know as Brittany. Kind of cousins of Erin, of the Isle of Erin, which...
Northern France.
and Ireland. And I thought it was really interesting that you read Gallier, because I also do, and jumping off from there, I was wondering if with the B'nai Lilith, they're left-handed, red-haired, green-eyed, freckled.
Sound Irish, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Is there any sort of
The Irish always come in.
conflation or sort of stories going across that merge into like the Irish cycles?
Okay, so that's hilarious because anybody who's ever had me as a teacher knows I have an obsession with Ireland, and I bring Ireland into everything, even if it's not connected. I stick in the Irish. So, interestingly enough, there is an Irish text from 1191 called in Gaelic Lawer Gabala Erin, which means the taking of the island of Ireland, which has a part where the ancient Celts, the ancient Irish, meet the ancient Jews when we are leaving Egypt with Moses. And so there's this whole cultural interchange, and I don't know if that's where the kind of Irish elements come into it, but we have jokes in Jewish tradition because one of the last names that's very common in Ireland is Levi. And a Levite in Jewish tradition were the temple priests. So
Well, and
I just have an obsession with everything Irish.
another shocking
That's bizarre.
or striking similarity is that music, particularly of North Africa, which has both Semitic, Jewish, and Arab influences, is strikingly similar to Irish music.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. And there's actually a lot of research about that. The connection between traditional Irish female unaccompanied singing, like the keening, right? Particularly at Irish funerals. And there's the image in Irish tradition of the banshee, the fairy woman who wails and keens before the death of a family member. And there is actually a huge connection. But that actually, I'm happy to tell you, I think there's a historical and not only a folkloric source, because many Irish monks from the late 8th to the late 10th century traveled throughout the Middle East, and many were in North Africa, and many were also in the Levant. So there was a real Irish golden age. It's really funny the way everything I do comes around to Ireland. Nothing is connected, but there was a real golden age of Irish tradition between the 8th to the end of the 10th century. And those Irish monks who traveled, they were great travelers, spent a lot of time in North Africa. They were also very open to learning from Muslim and Jewish tradition. So it's, the Irish follow me every day. So that's interesting. Any other question, comments? Gail, is that a question?
Not really, but I was in terms of the focusing on Lilith, and we have these kids coming around, and
Who are the kids?
Well, I mean, no, talking about
Oh, her
Solomon,
children.
her children.
Oh, B'nai Lilith.
And then she's running off all the time to go do this, so who's taking care of the kids?
Her husband.
Oh, she always leaves him home?
Satan is a good house husband.
Oh, okay, so
Yeah,
that's where it comes from.
and what's interesting is the angel of death, or Samael as he's called, in Hebrew is supposed to be a very, very loving father.
Oh.
And he's described as a loving father. And Lilith would prefer to stay at home, but her boss is always
Yeah.
calling her saying, you have to go and test someone's virtue. But it's not what she wants to do. And that's also, I think, where you can see women's rage. Okay, so, you know, because remember in the original Lilith legend, she's the vampire, she's the vixen, she seduces. And suddenly here you have, when women start retelling the story, it's, whoa, hey, all I want is a normal relationship. I've had it with human men. Give me the angel of death. He's cool. And
He
it
takes care of the kids.
Yeah, well, he takes care of the kids, right? He's he's a real feminist, Samael. So it's like, it's kind of, I think that is kind of a bit of women's rape. Stop imagining me either as a very naive, innocent nothing, or a whore. You know, there's between the two, there's something in the middle. So I think, yeah, I didn't even think of that, but that's a fascinating aspect of it. My student, Ebony.
Do the children also have like physical attributes like Lilith?
Yeah, so we went through that, but let me repeat them in case you have one of them. Are you left-handed?
Oh no, I know those, but like, do they look like the parents, like the fangs and everything?
They could look like Emma. They could look like Elif.
Okay.
In fact, Emma and Elif could be them. I mean, they can look. They're. The only way you know for sure is the green eyes, the freckles, red hair, and left-handed. Those are the obvious B'nai Lilith, the obvious children of Lilith. But according to the folklore, both the Muslim and the Jewish folklore, particularly that which comes from Peru, no, they can also hide it. So, for instance, Austin, who does not have green eyes and is not left-handed, you think he's innocent, but you know. So yeah, they can.
Okay.
Now you're going to watch out with Emma and Thank you. Was there another Riju?
I know, like, you mentioned that red was for, like, defending
Red
yourself.
wards off.
And I know, like, obviously red's huge for, like, Indian weddings, Indian festivals.
Oh, in Hindu tradition, it's super important.
And just, it's everywhere. So I was wondering if in, like, old world cultures or traditions there was just, like, a general, like, in terms of, like, you bring back, like, the balance or equilibrium with, like, red somehow?
With blood. Yeah,
Yeah.
lifeblood. So that's a fascinating question because, yes, in Hindu tradition, the color red is huge. And we find it's also just as important in Moche Indian tradition in the north of Peru. It was just as important for the Aztecs in the Mexican Valley. Apparently, it's an interesting question, it's kind of a universal because it represents lifeblood. So if you had a child, you gave a lot of lifeblood. And so it's the idea of what you just said is perfect. It's reestablishing the balance.
So it's not necessarily old world, it's just...
And it's everywhere. Yeah. It's just as important in all of the cultures in the Americas. Red is profoundly important.
And as a follow-up to that,
Yeah.
sort of, if I heard you right,
Go
sort
for
of, as the tradition being told switched from men to women, was that when sort of red became the protector versus
Yes.
initially green, which is right in a way the opposite?
Yes, exactly. Tillman, that's a fantastic point. When you have, just quickly to sum up, when you have the expulsion of the Jews from the Iberian Peninsula, from Spain and Portugal, and then the formal expulsion of the Muslims 100 years later, and everything is chaos, and everything is horrible, and people are dying, the folklore also changes, you know, and so as Tillman pointed out, before that, it's the color blue that protects. But suddenly when we get into the 16th and 17th and 18th centuries, and we're crossing oceans, and we're going to the Americas, and everything's crazy, and everything's frightening, then the color red becomes the protector color, and that coincides exactly with when women start telling the stories. Ebony.
I know that some Mexicans believe that to put on the red bracelet before giving birth, but does that come from the story of Lilith?
So that is absolutely fascinating. So it turns out that long before Jews who were fleeing Spain met Aztec Indians who were having a pretty hard time in Mexico during the conquest. The Aztecs also had that tradition. And they had it, archaeologically, I can tell you, at least back to the early 14th century, because you'll find red beads in Aztec graves as well. So that kind of, your connection kind of connects with Riju. It's kind of a universal. There's that idea of red lifeblood. You know, also if you visit Turkey or Greece, you'll find that Elif, right? You know, that's the Turkish tradition.
I was going to say, at Turkish weddings also, the bride, not all of them, but a lot of them, the bride, they'll put like a red band around her waist and tie it.
Yeah, that's exactly, and putting it around her waist, Elif, because Jewish and Muslim tradition are so close, putting it around the waist is really a symbol of, you know, it's Lilith will protect your child. So yeah, that's very important. Yeah, Turkey also had one of the most important Judeo-Spanish communities for many, many years in Istanbul and Izmir. Thank you. Riju.
Just to go off that real quick, my uncle's wedding, that was the only like real Indian wedding in India I had a chance to go to.
That must have been beautiful.
Yeah, it was like
Indian weddings are cool.
It was like they're all like 3 to 5 days traditionally, and like the bride like stepped in red paint or dye upon crossing the threshold and entering, and then like discreet like footsteps until she like sat down like next to the groom, I guess, and then Brahmin went through like everything, but like red was like she was wearing like shiddur here. Red was all like prevalent in the wedding.
Yeah, in Hindu tradition also, the god Shiva, you know, destroyer and creator, is often represented through the color red because it's death and life, and that's blood.
Or if you go to like Durga Puja or any like big puja, like all the idols are like
in red.
huge.
Yeah, and in the Hindu festival of Holi, when all those beautiful colors are spread around, red represents life. Folks, thank you so much. It's 1:30. You're all free. My students, please sign the sign-up sheet.